From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our audiences worldwide, I'm David Weston. Welcome now to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. We're seeing another tumultuous day in the markets with the equities markets selling off. They came back yesterday in response to those remarks from the president and his staff about possible $1.2 trillion spending increase. So they came up yesterday. They're back off now. You can see they're back down. You can see the S&P is down off 5.2% at the moment. At the same time, treasuries are also selling off, as they are around the world with sovereign debt, apparently because so many governments are saying they're going to borrow so much money to try to stimulate that it really has scared off some investors in treasuries as a practical matter. So let's talk now about that possible stimulus package that's going up to the Hill. We turn now to Libby Cantrell. She is PIMCO, head of public policy. So, Libby, thank you for joining us over the telephone. Libby, what do we know about this package? How cooked in is it?
Well, hi, David, and nice to be joining you. Hi, David. So I think it's important to keep in mind that we actually haven't seen a vote on the $100 billion stimulus. So if you think about this, the Congress is sort of addressing this in phases. They passed an $8 billion bill. They passed a $100 billion. They're trying to pass a $100 billion bill, and now they're going to try to work on this much bigger bill. But I think we should just keep in mind that it's been difficult to get this $100 billion stimulus package that's much more directly targeted at folks who are affected by the virus, sort of past the goal line. And so we need to sort of keep our expectations in check in terms of both timing and scope. $1 trillion is a big number. It would be obviously welcomed by the market and by the economy if it actually happens. But as you know, we're quite a far distance, and it's going to probably take quite a bit of time from here to there. So I think bottom line here is, good news if it actually happens. But I think the markets and investors should just keep their expectations sort of check in terms of how quickly this might actually turn into real stimulus.
Yeah, it's so important to keep in mind exactly what you said, which is we're talking about $1.2 trillion. We have $100 billion that the House passed. The Senate still hasn't acted on. They haven't done that yet. So how fast could we have something bigger? But beyond that, do we have a sense of what it's going to go for? As I understand it, some will be some amount of money, maybe $1,000 into people's pockets. That could be, I guess, about $300 billion, more or less. There's also some talk about deferring tax payments into the Treasury, which I guess is another $300 billion. Is there going to be money in there for the airlines, the $50 billion that they've talked about?
Yeah, I think this is going to be very multidimensional, right? And because this is such an unusual crisis in some ways, because this is not necessarily sort of your traditional kind of financial crisis, if you will, some of the more traditional fiscal policy tools may be more limited. So I think what we're going to see is a lot of focus on both the demand side, so as you said, try to get cash into people's pockets. I think the problem, though, is that if more folks become sort of quarantined or sequestered in their home, they're not necessarily going to be spending that in the real economy. And so you have to then do something for the supply side, for the industries who are also impacted. So that includes the bigger industries, like you said, in terms of transportation, airlines, and hospitality. But it also includes small businesses. I think you're going to see quite a bit of focus in terms of trying to provide at least some liquidity, some short-term liquidity, to the small businesses who are already facing a difficult time just in these past few weeks. And if this continues, are going to face much more kind of a headwind from an economic perspective.
Libby, it strikes me there's also a logistics issue here. As you say quite correctly, even if you got the $1,000, if that's what it is, into people's pockets, where can they go to spend it? Are we sure we can distribute $1,000 to upwards of 300 million Americans? Do we have the capacity to do that, particularly when we increasingly hear that the government workers themselves are supposed to work from home?
I mean, this is, you and I are probably more focused on the process issues here. And I think it's a really good point because, again, the headlines might sound great in theory, in practice, as you mentioned. Practically, this is likely going to take, longer. I mean, we've done this before, right? We've cut checks both in, after 9/11 and then after the great financial crisis. So practically speaking, there are processes and mechanisms to do this. But they may take longer than, again, the market or the economy may like. So, Secretary of State there's 2 weeks. That feels optimistic. Never say never. But it could be kind of a matter of weeks or even months here, certainly not days.
So, Libby, we heard from the president yesterday a lot of bipartisanship, saying that actually he's working very, very well with the Democrats. He even had some nice remarks for the Democratic governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo. Is that your sense? You know the Hill so well. Is it likely that the partisanship will fall away here because of this crisis and they'll all come together on whatever the plan is?
I think Americans hope that. Hope that's the case, and I think the market would also welcome that. I think that our expectations for some big bipartisan kumbaya should also be in check. We're already seeing folks like Senator Elizabeth Warren talking about, any sort of funding for the airlines are going to have to be have stringent conditions attached to it. So you're already seeing some of the more kind of traditional partisan ideology popping up. Even in this kind of very nascent days of this bigger stimulus bill. And the point there is that, maybe it's an opportunity for the parties to come together, but, split government is difficult, especially in this very partisan polarized context. So I'm not sure we're, again, going to see all of these sort of traditional partisan issues just melt away because of this.
Okay. Libby, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate that. That's Libby Cantrell. She is PIMCO Head of Public Policy. And now we want to get a check on the markets and exactly where we are at the moment. And for that, we turn to Taylor Riggs. So, Taylor, I'm watching this. I'm interested. Equities are down, of course, but actually U.S. Treasuries have turned around. Before, when I was looking at it, they were going the other way. Now it looks like people are buying them again.
Yeah, very interesting. So I was hearing a few things were going on within the Treasury market this morning. Of course, you had a global lift in bond yields as I think we woke up and thought, how are we going to pay for $1.2 trillion in stimulus? As earlier this year, all we could talk about was deficits. So I think that's why you got a big lift up in yields. There's also some liquidity issues, of course, that Mike McKee has been talking about all morning. There's also, I'm hearing some profit taking going on within the Treasury market. U.S. Treasuries, as you know, last week, 2 weeks ago, it hit 50 basis points. And so there was all of that sort of pressuring up in yields. I think now as the losses within the equity market have accelerated closer to that 6-7% lower bound, which is worse than maybe 3% where we were this morning. You're going sort of back into the risk off sentiment, buying up treasuries. I do keep hearing over and over again, nothing matters more though than the dollar, that you're liquidating even treasury bond funds at this point because you just want to hold cash.
Yeah, you want to hold cash, or you have obligations you have to pay for in dollars, and you need the dollars to pay for them. And it looks like around the world, people are rushing in to buy dollars whenever they can. What about oversold? Because I understand, basically, if you look at the technicals, it indicates equities are oversold. But as somebody said back in 2008, 2009, we went to oversold and stayed there for quite a while. It doesn't mean you're going to come back right away.
And I've been asking a lot of people about this. We talk about the technical levels within the equity market and when does it bottom out? The problem is, as you know, as all of our viewers know, this is not an economic issue. This is a health issue. So trying to catch a bottom in this environment, very, very tough. I would also try to fold that into some of the inflation expectations that we keep talking about and growth rates. If you come and take a look at this chart in the terminal, as you know, the story, oil, Brent, crude, just continuing to fall and fall. Usually, not a fan of these double axes, but I think the correlation here in the two between these are just unbelievable. And at what point, perhaps, would gas prices start to help the consumer? And as Libby Cantrell was talking about, be a boost for the consumer. The problem at this point, the consumer doesn't. Yeah,
I'm not sure they're going and filling up their cars with gas so they can drive around an awful lot.
Exactly.
It's going to take a little while for that to work its way out. But.
And I would also just mention quickly again some of the travel stocks that we're following, David. Yeah. Marriott just announced that they're going to be furloughing a lot of employees. So they're facing a record plunge. And also Delta Airlines as well could be cut to junk by Moody's. I don't want to sound hysterical, but these, again, are moves that we've seen where we're really starting to see real impacts.
Yeah, it's not hysterical. The facts are the facts. I mean, we have to own up to the facts, whatever they are. Thank you so much to Taylor Riggs for that report on the markets. And now we turn to Ritika Gupta. She's here with Bloomberg First Word News.
Thanks, David. Bernie Sanders is now reassessing his campaign for the Democratic presidential nomination. Sanders lost 3 primaries yesterday to frontrunner Joe Biden. His campaign manager says that before the next primaries, he'll be having conversations with supporters. The US and Canada will ban non-essential travel between the two countries. President Trump tweeted that the move will not affect trade. One official calls it essentially a ban on tourism and vacations. The British pound fell to its lowest level against the dollar in over 3 decades. The price dipped below $1.19. Investors have doubted the UK government's response to the coronavirus. Plus, there's increased demand for the dollar. Oil plunged below $25 a barrel for the first time in almost 18 years. Saudi Arabia made another attack in its price war with Russia. The Saudis promised to keep production at a record high over the coming months. That sent prices down more than 9%. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks so much, Ritika. Coming up, we're going to be speaking with the CEO of Verizon, Hans Vestberg, about how his company is coming to grips with increased usage of his system as so many customers now are working and studying from home. That's coming up next. This is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power. I'm David Weston. Major U.S. corporations are facing challenges on at least three fronts. One, taking care of their employees in the face of a pandemic. Then second, responding to rapidly changing consumer demand. And then finally, managing their businesses so they can come out the other side of this whenever that happens. We welcome now the leader of one of those major corporations. He is Hans Vestberg and is the chairman and CEO of Verizon. He comes to say from his home in New Jersey, I believe that's where you are. So welcome, Mr. Vestberg. Great to have you. Start where I know you start every single day with your 135,000 employees. What is their situation? What are you doing to try to keep them as safe as possible, at the same time keep the business going?
Thank you very much for having me. First of all, I'm at the Emergency Operations Center that we have. We have a couple of them around the globe where basically we gather all the information so we can manage all our stakeholders, the customers, their employees, all the society that we're serving in this moment. So we have these centers up across the globe in order to see what's happening. But when it comes to our 135,000 employees that are the main part in the US, of course, but also around the globe, I would say the majority of them are working from home today. But of course, there are exceptions. We still have stores open in the US where we serve our customers, which is important. We have reduced the opening hours and we have fewer stores open. And then we have the so important field technicians that are out in the field and seeing that our network is holding up, because there are two things that we are really focused at Verizon right now. Number one, the safe and healthy of our employees and our partners. And secondly, we also need to see that these crucial networks are up in this time, because communication right now is so important. So in our case, for example, we meet all our employees every day on a live webcast, all the 135,000 every day, to tell them what's happening. And then we understand the importance of network and communication.
So give us a sense of what strain that may be putting on your system, because as we're all told, as much as possible to stay home, work from home, there must be a lot more usage of your system.
In general, actually, the growth in the network is very limited. But the pattern has changed quite dramatically. We see gaming up 75% week over week. That's how much more gaming is in the network right now. We see 30% up on VPN. That's secure lines from enterprises because people are working from home. We see some 20% up on the web access, which probably also is video conferencing, etc. So we see that, and the pattern is moving out. And to be honest, we see less data usage in a city like New York City on the wireless network at the moment. So that's so important for us to constantly monitor that 24/7 to see where the capacity is moving. But from an overall network, we don't see any major growth in the network. It's very limited. It's more where the growth is happening and what type of application people are using. Our network is built very robust, so we have a lot of headroom in it, but we constantly need to monitor to see where we're on the right place and serving the most vulnerable in this situation. Of course, first responders, healthcare, super important for Verizon to see that those customers has all the access they need in these times, but also when it comes to education from home and all of that.
What are you learning about the pressure on your customers as a practical matter? I know that you have already said that you're going to waive late fees, you're going to not cut off service for 60 days for internet and things like that. Are you getting a sense from both individuals and, for that matter, small corporations? A lot of people are concerned about the small companies, about the sort of financial pressure they're feeling.
As the pledge we did with the other companies when it comes to keep America connected, we are trying to see that all the small and medium businesses are getting hold through this process for at least the next 60 days or how long this now going to be, where we're actually not going to turn them off or any late fees, we're going to charge them and all of that. So that's important. Of course, we hear some of them. We also hear a lot of large enterprises moving a lot of their capacity from their enterprises offices to have remote working, and that's a huge lift of capacity because usually enterprises has built all their capacity in the enterprise and the office, and now they need to do it from other places. So that we hear a lot about. So we reallocate a lot of circuits and a lot of capacity out in the market in order to see that our customers and their employees can actually operate as normal as possible in these times.
One of your competitors has actually extended unlimited data plans to everybody during this crisis. Are you considering anything similar to that?
We already have that on our Fios network. You basically are unlimited, as well as for any of the most important vulnerable groups right now. The first responders, they have sort of unlimited and they can use as much as they want. I think it's very important for this moment also to see where the patterns are going. Right now, we don't have any constraints on our network, but over time, when this is going to be for more than 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, then we definitely can measure and see how we can opt up our systems and our capacity for our customers depending on where we see the constraints. We're very early on into this sort of moment of the coronavirus. I would say 1 week or 2 more, we're really going to see how these patterns are turning out in the network.
As you say, we're early on in it, but it's not too early perhaps to start taking a look at questions like, do you need to conserve cash? What's it going to do to your free cash flow? What's it going to do to your earnings? And do you have to reconsider the way you allocate capital? For example, things like capital investment in 5G. Are you going through that process right now?
I think that we already went through that process last week. So when it comes to the CAPEX, we actually decided to increase our CAPEX last week for 2 reasons. One, we wanted to see that we are really sure we're going to continue to have this robust network and the headroom we have. And secondly, we think it also is the right thing to do for a large corporation, responsible as Verizon is. We actually went out and increased our CAPEX guidance last week, and we are in between 17 to 18, and we went to 17.5 to 18.5 billion US dollars in CAPEX in 2020. That was one thing. The other thing we did was also that yesterday we went out to the market and looked out for liquidity, and we had the bond offering that will close on Friday this week. So yes, we're looking into that, but we are actually moving forward because we think it's an important time of the US and for US and for Verizon to actually do more investments.
You have your hands full running a very big company in Verizon, but as you look at what's going on in Washington, do you have any advice or any desire about what you'd like to see coming out of Washington, whether it's the administration working with Congress? What do you think they need to do to really minimize at least the damage that clearly is coming?
I think that we all are working with our constituencies and seeing that is going right. I don't have any major advice for the Washington, what they're doing right now. We are, of course, working constantly with them, seeing that this critical infrastructure, like the networks, are up and running, because that's very, very important. The healthcare is, of course, very important, the infrastructure, the hospitals and all of that. But communication is also extremely important, so we can keep up and communicate with people what's happening and giving them guidance. So I think that's the message we have. Remember, or not remember, I know they remember, but that understanding the importance of the critical infrastructure in this moment as the communication networks are.
Yeah, it certainly is critical right now, no doubt about it. Okay, thank you so much, Hans Vestberg. He is Verizon CEO. Coming up, the primaries that went ahead despite the virus. Our contributor Jeannie Zaino is here to take us through some big wins for former Vice President Joe Biden. That's coming up next on Balance of Power. This is Balance of Power. I'm David Weston. The coronavirus didn't stop 3 states from holding primaries yesterday. Former Vice President Joe Biden was the big winner, sweeping victories in Florida, Illinois, and Arizona. He now has a lead that will make it difficult for Senator Bernie Sanders to catch up. Welcome now, by way of Skype, Bloomberg contributor and Iona College political science professor, Jeannie Zaino. So good to see you. I hope you're doing well, Jeannie. So it's hard to believe, actually, that we're having primaries, given what else is going on. But give us a sense. Joe Biden just seems to be running away from it right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was quite a day yesterday. We knew that Ohio was supposed to be voting yesterday, but they postponed due to the coronavirus. But 3 states continued. That was Florida, Illinois, and Arizona. And interestingly, while in-person voting was down in all 3 states, voting was actually up in 2 states, in Florida and Arizona. It's been down a little bit by reports in Illinois, but the reason it was up was because those states are allowing early voting and mail ballot voting. So that's going to be a lesson for all of these states going forward during this coronavirus crisis.
Well,
and of course, as you mentioned,
sorry, Jeannie,
yeah.
that's the question going forward, because things seem to be getting tighter and tighter and tighter and worse and worse. Are we going to be able to have the rest of the primaries?
You know, we don't know yet. We've seen at least a few states already have postponed, as Ohio did, Georgia did, a few other states. We have several states rolling in over the next month or so. They may postpone, or they may go the way of Florida and Arizona and do more mail ballot and early voting. People are even talking about drive-by balloting, drive-by voting. So that can be a way to keep people going to the polls. Of course, it's not just the voters getting to the polls and voting. It's also getting poll workers there. They tend to be in their 60s and 70s nationwide, and they may not be comfortable going to high school gyms at this point to allow for voting to continue. So I think we're definitely going to see a change in that direction.
And things may change. Obviously, they may change. But at a time the president is telling us we shouldn't be in groups of more than 10, how do you have a convention?
Absolutely. And I think that's a big question. If things don't subside by the summer, I think we may see those conventions either postponed or canceled, or maybe they change the format of those. Like so many of us, as you know, so many of us are now working online. I don't know how the conventions would do that, but we may see a change in that regard. At this point, we just don't know how this thing is going to pan out by the time we get to the summer.
And by the way, as you know, Jeannie, in the meantime, the Congress is trying to figure out how they act, because Senator Durbin now is saying maybe we do it by remote, and there's some proposals in the House of Representatives not to have more than 30 people in the chamber at a time.
Absolutely. So our Congress is average age 63 years old. And at a time when you hear the CDC and the government saying you shouldn't, as you mentioned, gather in groups of 10, particularly for people in that age group, how can you ask senators to not only be gathering to vote, but also to be flying back and forth between their states, many of which are impacted, to Washington? So we heard this call for Dick Durbin to move online, but it's been resisted by Mitch McConnell and others.
A lot of things to figure out. Thank you so much to Bloomberg contributor Jeannie Zaino. Coming up here, the U.S. and Canada mutually agree to close their border. We're going to talk with Michael Chertoff, former head of Homeland Security, about how you go about doing that. This is Bloomberg. From New York, this is Balance of Power. I'm David Weston. For Bloomberg First Word News, we turn now to Ritika Gupta.
Thanks, David. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell says the Senate will vote today that House-approved coronavirus aid bill. And he says senators won't leave town until they finish work on a third, much larger assistance measure. McConnell says that bill is needed to put money directly in the hands of Americans. He says it also must help small businesses. Canada's come out with its own stimulus plan. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's proposal is worth 3% of the Canadian economy. The value, $56.7 billion, about a third of it directly supports individuals and companies. The rest pays for tax deferrals for households and businesses. Meanwhile, the United States and Canada are closing the border between the two countries to non-essential traffic. President Trump says trade between the two nations will not be affected. One official calls it essentially a ban on tourism and vacations. Bernie Sanders is staying in the race for the Democratic presidential nomination for now. But the word from his campaign manager isn't promising. He says Sanders is speaking with supporters to assess his campaign. That came the morning after Joe Biden swept all 3 states that held Democratic primaries: Arizona, Illinois, and Florida. Biden won every county in Florida. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks so much, Ritika. So we are waiting right now for the task force report from the White House today. President Trump has said he will come out and make an important announcement involving the FDA. You can see right now the podium we're waiting for. We'll bring you that in whole or in part because we're also waiting for a live briefing from Governor Andrew Cuomo of New York. So we'll bring you all of that as it develops. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television. This is Balance of Power. I'm David Weston. We are waiting right now for what is turning out to be a daily briefing from the White House from President Trump on what's going on with the coronavirus. And we're going to bring you that when it happens. In the meantime, we want to turn to exactly what the U.S. government overall can do in response to an epidemic such as this, including the Department of Homeland Security. It is really on the front lines for important parts of the effort to battle this virus. We welcome now Michael Chertoff. He's a former Homeland Security Secretary who served under President George W. Bush and is the co-founder and executive chairman of the Chertoff Group. He comes to us today on the telephone. So, Mr. Secretary, thank you so much for joining us. Let's start with the news from this morning, at least one piece of news from this morning, which is the closing of the U.S.-Canada border, at least to people, apparently not to trade. How does that work, and what's the role of Homeland Security in helping ensure that that gets closed?
Well, the Homeland Security Department has responsibility for managing the border through Customs and Border Protection. So what they will do if there's an order to lock down the border is basically stop all passengers from going back or forth across the border. Obviously, with respect to trade, if someone is driving a truck with cargo, that may be allowed through, and they'll have to do the specific analysis of exactly how they manage that process. But they will basically control all crossings at ports of entry.
It strikes me that there are some probably Americans who are visiting Canada and Canadians who are visiting America who got caught out. How will that, in all likelihood, work? I don't know. I haven't seen the announcement. You may not know either. But how could that work? I drive up to the border and say, look, I just was over visiting for the day. I got caught.
What they have generally done in the past, when the president closed the borders in the last couple of weeks, is they created an exception for American citizens or permanent residents returning back home. They may require them to be in quarantine for 14 days, but they generally do not exclude Americans from returning to their home.
So talk to us more broadly, if you can, about the role of Homeland Security beyond controlling the border and perhaps helping with some of the efforts that the president's announced to combat this virus. I mean, the goal is clear. We want to slow down the spread of the virus. Can't stop it. Slow it down. What can Homeland Security do besides the border? Or is that their principal function right now?
Well, the main function of Homeland Security, particularly through the Federal Emergency Management Agency, is helping to manage the response, which is what they do in any natural disaster, be it an earthquake, a hurricane, a forest fire, or a flood. In this case, it's largely a logistical issue. What they will do is coordinate with other federal agencies and with the private sector to acquire the kinds of goods and products that are necessary in order to respond to this crisis. So it may mean beds, it may be tents, it may be medical supplies they can contract for. One of the things which has been done in the past is the military, through FEMA, has been able to provide medical facilities, field hospitals, even hospital ships to deal with emergencies. So I think that's likely to be the main emphasis of FEMA. And then, as you mentioned earlier, the border will obviously also be an important element for DHS.
Is it likely or possible that the government somewhere has actually stockpiled some of the medical equipment that's needed? We heard the vice president yesterday call upon construction companies to volunteer to give up some of their, I think they're called N95 masks that can be used for medical purposes as well. Is it possible that either in the military or Homeland Security, someplace else, that in fact people would have something of a warehouse with these things in it?
Well, there will be some material stockpiled, not really DHS, which does not really stockpile things, but there will be some things stockpiled in the military, some stockpiled with HHS, some in the private sector. The difficulty here is the scale. Usually you're stockpiling for a relatively local or regional disaster, and obviously the military is stockpiling because it has forces that it has to protect. The issue is how do you scale that for a national crisis? And I think that is why you're seeing an emphasis on trying to get more masks and more medical products produced as quickly as possible.
So, as a practical matter, can the military help through things like the Army Corps of Engineers? That's something that Governor Cuomo called upon the government to do, to build more hospital beds. Is that something you would have coordinated with the Army on?
Yeah, what DHS would do would be coordinating with the Army about what kind of medical capabilities they can make available. As I said, there are a couple of hospital ships that can be moved offshore and be used as hospitals. You would work with the Army Corps of Engineers, for example, to go set up an emergency medical facility in a stadium or in a large arena. And so all of these are things that can be done. The challenge here is going to be scale and priority.
And is it possible to both really pull out all the stops, do everything possible to fight this virus at the same time that we don't let some other things slip up, and particularly national security? We saw earlier today a report from Bloomberg that was then confirmed, I believe, that HHS computers have been hacked in an apparent attempt to slow down the response. I mean, you know so much, you've written a fine book on the question of cybersecurity. Are we more vulnerable right now on other fronts because we are so consumed with this coronavirus?
So I would say it's a mix. In one area, actually, the risk has diminished. So we have been obviously worried for several years now about the possibility of attacks on crowded locations, be they entertainment locations or schools or religious institutions. That risk is going to go down because there aren't going to be crowds. And so the target set will be less. But on the other side, cyber is going to be more of an issue. And that's particularly true because what you have now is people working from home who used to go to the office. And their facilities may not be secure in the way that is necessary to protect their business institutions or their government agencies from being hacked. And that's why I think a big urgent requirement is going to be to elevate the quality of cybersecurity now that you have all of these individuals using their home computers to log on to work.
Give us a sense of what you've seen, because Chertoff Group really works, as I understand it, with companies on exactly that sort of issue. What is the state of preparedness in the private sector, not the public sector, but the private sector, for possible violations through cyber? Because as you point out, we're relying on it more than we ever have in history.
I think many companies are not well prepared for this because they hadn't imagined a situation where there has to be a major shift from having people using office computers or otherwise work-provided computers into using home computers being remote. So I think there's going to have to be an effort to quite properly scale up the level of cybersecurity and also to institute some element of control over exactly who logs on and where. More generally, we've been working with clients on business continuity plans. Mm-hmm. What is their resilience plan? What do they do if this is going to be more than a few weeks but continues further than that? How do they deal with mitigating risk to the supply chain? This is all part of the general issue of resilience, which is always an important element of preparedness.
So, Mr. Secretary, in all of your planning, whether you're at DHS, even back in the Justice Department, the DHS, and now with the Chertoff Group, did something like this ever come up? Did you have a hypothetical that said, what happens if we have a pandemic and that lasts for some extended period of time?
Oh, absolutely, yes. I mean, when I was at DHS, we put together a pandemic plan. We were then worried about avian flu. And we looked at all the issues like controlling the borders, getting medical supplies to people, dealing with an extended period of people having to be home. So all of these challenges have been part of the planning process in the U.S. government for almost 20 years. Now, the issue is to what extent they've been refashioned or amended or brushed up to deal with modern circumstances. One thing we did not have when we were doing the plans back 15 or 20 years ago was the amount of connectivity over the Internet. So that has actually changed the dynamic both in making it easier to work from home, but also introducing the element of cyber risk, which we've seen with this attack on HHS.
Okay, Mr. Secretary, thank you so much for joining us. That's Michael Chertoff. He's the former Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security and now the co-founder, and he runs the Chertoff Group in Washington. Coming up here, we're going to bring you a live briefing from the White House where President Trump and the coronavirus task force is expected to brief reporters. This is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power. I'm David Weston. We are waiting right now for a briefing for the president and his coronavirus task force at the White House. The people are gathering right now, and he has said he's going to have a major announcement, he says, having to do with the FDA. Joining us to discuss is Bloomberg's chief Washington correspondent, Kevin Cirilli. So, Kevin, thank you so much for joining us. Do we have any sense of what we're going to hear today from the president and his team?
We're likely going to hear an update, David, based upon my reporting with regards to an update in how different medicines are being treated and in development to combat the coronavirus. There are various different vaccines that are already in testing around the world, as well as here in the United States. And there are also other medicines that the government has streamlined from the private sector in order to get them into the market as quickly as possible. And they've tweaked some regulations to bring them to market. So likely the president's going to provide an update on that front. Meanwhile, the economic stimulus continues onward as lawmakers on both sides of the aisle really speaking from the same economic playbook here and embracing the idea of injecting liquidity and cash flow quickly into the market in a series of phases. And that's anticipated to happen over the next 10 days.
Yeah, at the same time, New York Governor Cuomo is having a news conference right now in which he says we added 1,000 cases since Tuesday in one day in New York. And now we have a report that in Europe they have more confirmed cases of coronavirus than they had in China. So things are certainly going to get worse before they get better. The president said that before. On the economic stimulus plan, do we have a sense of how long that might take? Because is the House even in session right now? I mean, they're dealing with Senate, I know.
Precisely. So the first portion of the economic stimulus plan is nearing completion with Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell and Speaker Pelosi, as well as Senate Majority Leader McConnell, have said that they will do whatever it takes in order to advance this coming out of the administration as it relates.
But Kevin, is that the $1 billion one, the one that has free testing in it and sick pay? Is that one?
Yes, and then as it relates to the helicopter money, that's an additional stimulus that they're also going to inject. So the bottom line is that Republicans and Democrats, David, have virtually erased their partisan lines as it comes to economic stimulus. And the administration, as well as Democrats, have also said that as more testing sites are opened, that more data, and that is so crucial to this, the data is going to be injected into this. So with more testing sites open and more people getting tested, that means that more of the confirmed cases are going to unfortunately escalate, but everyone's still being advised to stay home.
And they gave us some fairly specific numbers about testing yesterday, how many people were being tested and how rapidly it was ramping up. So I assume we're going to get that information again, because if they don't volunteer it, I'm sure some of the people in that room are going to ask the question.
Absolutely. And the private sector also helping out with that free testing. President Trump addressed the Business Roundtable earlier this morning. Of course, the Business Roundtable, a massive coalition of the top CEOs in the country. He took that call from the Oval Office. And so you're seeing the private sector really being relied upon for the free testing. And as, again, those sites continue to open, there are new developments in this. The various senators, mostly on the Democratic side, are pressuring for the administration to utilize the Army Corps of Engineers to construct hospitals, rapid creation of hospitals. That's something that we saw in China. It's something that's being discussed as well in Europe. But with that pressure, that would ramp up development in many of these hotspot areas that are significantly impacted by the disease, mostly in the cities, to create hospitals to combat this as quickly as possible.
Kevin, let me take you back for a moment, if I could, to this stimulus package or spending package that's being talked about. We heard from Secretary of Treasury yesterday, Steve Mnuchin, as he addressed it in this briefing that happened yesterday. If it's a $1.2 trillion or anything like it, it's an appropriations bill. It has to start in the House, doesn't it? Check my constitutional history here.
No, it absolutely does. And yesterday I went through all of the procedurals with some House staffers and representatives in the House and their teams. And what they say is that they are fully prepared to get this rolling, and that honestly, David, based upon my reporting, the holdout is not going to be Democrats. It will likely be a few outlier conservatives who have issues with this. That said, there is not, based upon my reporting and other reports as well, there is not any significant risk that economic stimulus would be stalled. I mean, to take a step back for a second, people like Senator Mitt Romney, a Republican from Utah, they're calling on there to be helicopter cash to be injected into liquidity. That stat and what Moody's put out yesterday in terms of an analysis that 70% of Americans don't have enough money saved up for 6 months. I mean, as this goes on, I mean, folks need that liquidity immediately. And so that has been, as Treasury Secretary Mnuchin has explained, that is something that the Treasury Department understands. It's something that they are working hand in hand with Democrats on, as well as with Republicans. And based upon my reporting, I don't see a significant political risk that would not be executed in the next 10 days.
But Kevin, let me ask a mechanical question, if I could. As we're watching, actually, people gather together. They've postponed the briefing, I guess, until noon. As the people gather in that rather small briefing room, for the president to say, once again, we shouldn't have 10 people together in one room. How on earth do you get 535 people together in Congress at a time we're not supposed to get together in groups larger than 10 in order to get a stimulus package passed?
David, that is a great question. It's a fair question, and it's a question that newsrooms are grappling with. It's a question that staffs are grappling with. I asked that to a lawmaker just within the last 48 hours about from a staff management perspective. Remember, these lawmakers are essentially the CEOs of their own small business working in a large corporation's environment in the campus of Capitol Hill. And what this lawmaker told me was that they were relying, just like other businesses are, on teleconferencing, on telecommunications, and that ultimately they do have experience in this regard. We're in uncharted territory, but think back to a government shutdown. Think back to post 9/11, where essential employees would likely be allowed onto the premise, and staffers would largely encourage to stay home. But you know, Congress, governments all over the world, just like in the United States, grappling with this as well.
Okay, thank you so much to our chief Washington correspondent. He's Kevin Swirly, reporting from Washington. And now we want to check back in on the markets. Joining us is Kelly Lyons. I still see a lot of red when it comes to equities.
It's a lot of red. Yet again, we're seeing that we cannot hold on to any kind of gain. We haven't seen back-to-back gains on the S&P 500 since February 12th. That's proving true again today. Granted, we are off the lows of the session, but still down about 5%. I mean, to me, this is the exact opposite of a Teflon market in that no matter what you throw at it, anything positive, promises of stimulus, action from central banks, nothing really seems to stick because none of that seems to offset, at least in investors' minds, the economic impact that is going to be this coronavirus with more cases being reported every single day.
At the moment, it looks like investors don't like anything except for cash, greenbacks, U.S. dollars, right? Because they're not buying bonds either. And goodness knows, look what happened to oil today. I mean, there's nothing they want other than cash, it looks like right now.
Right. It's a crazy day when I say a 5% move on equities isn't even the story of the day. I mean, you're looking at Italian BTPs have swung 70 basis points today alone because on the one hand, you have trillions of dollars in stimulus being promised, but then you have action on the central bank's parts. And of course, people are really looking for cash. So we've seen bonds all across the spectrum really swinging on that, munis included. Credit, of course, as we know, still in crisis. But on the point of oil, I mean, oil is now at its lowest since 2002 for WTI. And in that end, you have the demand problem with this virus obviously still in play. People aren't driving, they aren't taking planes. That means that people aren't consuming oil, and you have the supply issue with Saudi Arabia and Russia seeming to get no closer to a resolution on this price war.
Yeah, you got WTI looking at Bloomberg here, $23 basically, $23 a barrel, and I don't know where they're going to store it. Sooner or later, they're going to have to find a place to put it because nobody's buying it at the moment.
Right, and same goes for Brent. I mean, Brent's around $26 a barrel, lowest since 2003.
And I think it bears mentioning, this is also on a day when both last night and today, the Fed has taken various actions that on another day would have been seen as fairly dramatic actions of sort of opening up the discount window and really supporting the marketplace. And you're having the market just keep ripping right through it.
I mean, they are taking out the crisis playbook and really throwing everything they have at it. I think the issue is they are addressing short-term liquidity issues. And you could probably make the same argument about a lot of the stimulus that the Trump administration is proposing. Again, you may solve a short-term liquidity problem for small businesses, for airlines, et cetera. But there is this broader question of just how long this health crisis is going to linger. And short-term liquidity resolution isn't going to solve that broader, potentially longer-lasting economic fallout.
And despite all that dollar liquidity, the dollar just keeps going up. Which is not going to make it that much easier for people who owe their payments for their debt in dollars. It makes it more and more expensive to repay those at a time when they're really under crunch.
Right, it's a total catch-22. I mean, the dollar relative to others, especially, I mean, the British pound, I think, hit the lowest since 1983 today. I mean, the action in the currency market, in the commodity market, in the bond market, and in the equity market, we're seeing these incredible levels of volatility, really just extremes on all ends. And frankly, there is not a lot of sign that any of that is going to let up anytime soon.
So there's no such thing as a safe harbor in this world, but is there anything that's a little less risky? Is there anything safer as you look at the markets? Is anybody saying, well, that's a little bit better there?
I would say that there are some coronavirus plays here. If there are any winners in this market, it's the staples. Think anything that you need if we are in a shelter-in-place kind of scenario. Kroger is higher today. Stocks like Peloton have been doing really well. Things that, or DoorDash, Grubhub, all of those kind of stocks are getting a little bit of a benefit because if people are staying in their homes, they need everything brought to them. So that is not good for retail, for brick and mortar, but that is good for some of those players. And those are the stocks that you are seeing higher today, but there's not many of them.
Good for you, a little bit of a silver lining. Good for you, well done. Kayla Lyons reporting on the markets. Coming up, we're going to bring you a live briefing with the White House where President Trump and the coronavirus task force are expected to brief reporters, among other things, on some changes they're making to the FDA to try to facilitate selling some medicine for this virus. This is Bloomberg.